Hi guys, and welcome to a new lesson where we'll be getting into web programming with Python, and we'll also start to look at a Flask web framework in this lesson. So first, a little bit about web programming with Python. So in the preceding lesson we took a look at the requests library. In this session we are going to see a little bit of the technologies requests employ under the hood, and then using the Flask web framework we'll take the lending library, give it a web interface and make it interactive via a browser. But first you should understand just how things are working before we put big balls on them. So Flask, if you just Google for Flask, you'll find it here, flask.poku.org. You have all the documentation there. And installing Flask is pip install and Flask. I have already installed it, and you should also have pip installed depending on your computer settings or which OS you are using. So make sure you have pip installed. So let's get back to our slides here. So using the Python HTTP modules, Python is incredibly powerful, versatile and easy to use. Part of the reason for this is all the built-in functionality that comes with the base Python install. When you install Python, you also get a plethora of modules that you can use. Included in these modules are the HTTP modules, http.server and http.client, and a few others. So in this section, we will work with the HTTP server module to see just how easy it is to spin up a quick HTTP server, so that you can quickly begin serving web pages for debugging and testing purposes. So in this section we'll also illustrate just how some of the more popular third-party libraries use Python's built-in modules to create incredibly powerful tools for the Python developer. So let's take a look at the HTTP server module and just how quickly you can get up an HTTP server up and running locally, and then we'll move on to the Flask framework. So we will create try to create a HTTP server, and in just few lines of code, an HTTP server that will run locally and serve our pages that we'll create and serve out of our local directory. So after this exercise, you should have a good idea of just how some of the more popular frameworks and third-party libraries implement Python's built-in modules to harness incredible power to create easy-to-use tools. So let's first create a HTML file. I'll just open my Sublime Text, my text editor. I like to use text editor for just creating HTML files. So I don't use PyCharm for that. So let's create an index.html file. So this should be relatively quickly to type in. So Sublime Text gives us all that we need in one go. and save this file in the folder that you're working as index.html. Now we have created the file and move into the correct directory, and we see we have an index.html file here. And now we need to fire up our Python interpreter in the command line and import the two built-in modules that we need. These are the modules that we need, and let us decide which port we want to use to serve the data. You are free to use any port you want, but I'll use the 8080 port. And note that the variable port is in all caps because it is a constant, which means it will not be changed within our program. And now let's set up a handler, which we can call handsy, to handle the requests we'll be sending. And now that we have a request handler, we can set up our simple HTTP daemon or HTTPD, because that's how most Unix conventions name these things. Here. Okay, I have a forgot parentheses there. Typing. So what are we doing here? We're passing an empty string, the port constant, and then the variable handsy, which is a request handler object. So try to think what is happening here, and it may help to write this down on paper in paragraph form. So finally, we need to serve the directory to the correct port so that you can access it via your browser. So if we move to our browser and point to localhost.8080, we should see the file that we created, the HTML file. So, and then we move back to our terminal. We see where our servers are running, and we are getting the first message is the most important one. So this means that the status of 200 If you remember that, it's meaning OK, and the server found the index HTML file and was able to serve it to the client. And the favicon it didn't find, so that's why it says 404. So it's pretty easy, huh? So how does this work? So Python's built-in HTTP modules enables us to quickly spin up a small HTTP server to serve simple pages. So I recommend that you check out the documentation for the HTTP server module. And the HTTP.server module will search in the directory provided for an index.html file. We provided an empty string, which means the directory you were in when you started the server. And if there is an index.html file, it will serve that file. So if that file is not present, HTTP server uses the list_directory method to list the contents of the present directory. This is helpful for debugging and testing code, but it shouldn't be used for production systems. However, if you want to make a larger library, such as the Flask library we'll be using, or the requests library that we used earlier, you can write code around these built-ins that will create helpful tools to use later on. So one note is that Python 3 makes creating an HTTP server even easier. You can go to the directory you want to serve through the HTTP server and simply run this command. I will show you here. I just interrupted it with Control-C. So, like I said, you can go to the directory that you want to serve through the HTTP server and simply run this command. Excuse me. And the port you want it to listen to. So that command will serve the directory on localhost at the port you provided. So if in this lesson where you go to the directory where we are working, where you find our index file stored, and run this command in the terminal, you'll be able to point your browser to http://localhost.8080, and we will see our index file. So now let's move on to exploring the Flask framework, and this is where the fun is going to start now. So we will take a closer look at the Flask framework. So it's a third-party library written in Python that will help you to do everything from creating your own APIs to creating a full web-based application. Flask supports templating using the Jinja template system, and therefore you can use it as an all-in-one web framework. You use this functionality for the next part of this section. So before you begin, you'll need to install Flask. If you haven't done it, please do it. Use pip install Flask as I showed you earlier. We'll be using the SQLite 3 for our database. So luckily SQLite 3 comes with Python 3, and from section 3 you should I have demonstrated how you install SQLite on Windows. And SQLite is a smaller database that is perfect for this example app that we are going to work on right now. So if you are doing a larger app, we recommend that you take time to research larger databases such as PostgreSQL, SQL Alchemy, or many of the other available databases, including the NoSQL databases such as Redis. For the purpose of this lesson, however, we'll use SQLite, which is a very easy, small, and lightweight database. So once you have Flask installed, you'll set up a very simple app, which you will build on to complete the larger app. So one note on Flask is that Flask has Python 3 support, but only in 3.3 and newer. Older versions of Python 3, 3.2 and older will not work. Also, most plugins are developed under 2.7, supporting them to Python 3. Though possible is an undertaking left to you students, so do your own research. So should you encounter any abnormalities and cannot find help via an internet search, going back to Python 2.7 and using Flask in that environment is recommended, and you can use a virtual environment for that, virtual env for that. So to start, you want to set up the directory structure where each part of our project will live. You can set up projects in many different ways, and each tutorial that you find on the web shows you a different way, but the basic idea is the same, because we will be working in an MVC like environment, like model view controller environment, and we're going to want to separate out each piece of the project. So you can either unzip the files that are provided as a zip file in the first video section of this section, or you can structure the directory like I'm doing. So I'll go to the folder that I'm working on, and I'll create a few folders, and this will be the Lendy folder, and within that I will create a new folder called static, and one more folder for our templates. This is the main app folder, and under that it's the folders that we will put some files into, and I'll explain in a minute. So this structure is similar to how most projects start out. You want to separate each piece of the project. The static directory holds static files such as images and scripts. The templates directory is where the templates will live. So let's look at each piece of the typical MVC architecture. So model, let me go back to my presentation files. So let's look at each piece of a typical MVC architecture. Model, this is where the data models live, or the tables in the database. This is going to be the table for our users, and it's not secure. And the items that will be lending from our lending application, the tool hire application that we have been working on with all this course. View, this is where the users will see what you show them in the browser and how they interact with the data, and where the data will go once the next step does its job. Controller, this is the part of the app that controls the data flow. Users interact with this part, so a user may send form data to the backend, which is picked up via the controller part of the project. This part interacts with the model and can initiate either an update, creation, or even deletion. This is also the heaviest part of the app, in that this part receives data from the model layer and returns it to the view. This is basically the brain of your web app. So let's see how all of these pieces fit together by creating the basics for our web app. So we're going to create our data models in Flask. And so in this example, you will be using the LendiDB database that we created in section 3. Or you can just copy that file from the zip file I have provided. You need that. Without that, we created it in the section creating the LendiDB SQL database. We're going to use the same file here. And we will use two of the data entries, a member and an item. An item. Members will be able to log in and view the inventory of items and add items to the inventory. We'll be using a text editor and saving files in this exercise. So you will not be using any security measures for the sake of time. So however, you should be very familiar with the most common security practices before setting up a public web interface. So you are advised to check out the documentation for Flask. The data model for this application consists of the two files from section 3, lendidata.py, which is the API, and lendi.db, which is the actual database. So you need to copy both of these into your Lendi folder. So let's do that. So if you go, let me just find the files. So if you have extracted your folder from the zipped file, I have just called the whole folder for files for testing 5. But it includes all the files that you need. So you need to copy the lendi.py and lendi.db file and lendi.data.py and copy that into your Lendi application. So copy that in. So and now let's create the core Flask files. And let's click on the project, create a new Python file, and we will call this Lendi. The complete file is already included, so if you don't want to type the whole section here, but it's important that you understand this. So it's very important that you type the code. Don't just copy and paste, because you will not learn anything. I'd advise you to type them in, and this why I am just using these files is to save time for you. But in this section, I'm going to type out everything because it's important to understand, and I will copy, try to comment as good as I can. So let's import the important stuff, and I will explain in a little what I am doing. So the first two lines here, I import the libraries and modules we'll be using. The first line is importing the SQLite 3 and OS modules, which come with Python, as well as the Lendi Data API module that we created in section 3, where we used with data management with Python. And the second line is importing only the modules from Flask library that we will be using. So this is good practice when it comes to imports. Only import those modules and libraries that you'll actually be using. Remember, when you import, you are running all the code in that file that you have designated in the import. So if a module has 40 methods, you'll be importing all those method definitions. So import only that which you'll be using. And now let's set up the config for our file. This is not a comment. That's what I thought. Need to get the parentheses right. And we need a comma. I'll explain in a minute. So here we are creating our Flask object and assigning it the name of app. We are then setting up our Flask config properties because everything in Python is a first class object. You can modify this object as needed if you want. So note the underscore underscore name underscore underscore variable being passed around in the first two lines. And remember, when a Python script runs, depending on how it was run, directly as the main module by running it with the command python and app.py, for example, or directly by importing it from another main Python file, the Python interpreter sets the underscore underscore name underscore underscore variable to either main or the name of the file that was being imported. Here you are passing the name variable to Flask and to the config from object methods. This will be determined by how you're running your script, as main or as the name of your script. In our case, the name variable here will be set to lengthy. And next we are going to update the dict that goes along with our Flask object. Python objects are basically dicts all the way down, which is the reason you can modify them at any time. The all caps indicate that you are setting constant variables that will never change. These variables are going to be passed around in the app and help you to run your program. First, you have the database variable, which is declaring where the database file will reside. SQLite creates a simple file that is the database, which is why it's light. This os.path.join call is simply setting up the path to the SQLite file that you'll be making in a moment. Second, you have the debug equals to true. This is because you are in development mode. When you're ready to send your Flask project to production, you want to set this variable to false. Next, you have the secret key. This variable should be something random, long and hard to guess. Here it is set to be none of those things for illustrative purposes. This key will help to keep your client-side session secure. So finally, you have the username and password. These are the credentials for your app. Because you're making a very simple app, we're going to store this in the config and not in a database. These, of course, should be set up to be more difficult than shown here and put into a database and encrypted. But again, for our purposes, security isn't the first concern here. This is a tutorial, and also it is assumed that your app will remain private and locally hosted for now. So the last line is important for later. So this sets up an environment called lendy_settings, which contains the config variables. However, you set those here, so this config file doesn't exist yet, which is why the silent equal true flag is set. This will ignore errors if the config file isn't found. Should you want to add a config file, you need the lendy_settings variable to point to said config file. So now let's dissect this database connections, because this is where the heart of the app lies. So we'll write out some function for the database. Comments are always good. Put this on the new line. decorator. Some comments in there as well. And so this code in a nutshell opens a database connection so that you have a handle on the SQLite database and can perform functions on it. There is an init_db function in there, which you will use in a moment. There is also a bit of Flask magic, which with the get_db method call. This is opening a new connection if one doesn't exist yet, and the G variable is a special object in Flask that is valid for the active request only. This keeps data integrity through various request objects. Finally, the code opens the database. Then once the app is done using the connection, it closes the connection with the lengthy data.close function. Note in the @app.teardown_app context decorated method, you are once again using the G object. This object is really flask.g, but because we imported it directly, we can use it simply G. This object keeps each request separate so that if you close a database connection, you aren't closing all the database connections or other connections. This is part of the ease and simplicity of using libraries. Many times libraries will include things like this G object, which makes your job much easier so that you can simply do the tasks that you need to do. In our case, open and close database connections per connection, without having to fuss with the minute details or intricacies of each part. So now let's add the magic. So here is where the magic of all Python scripts is invoked and made. So if you remember, we spoke about the __name__ and the __main__. So what do they mean exactly? So when Python runs a script, a hidden variable called name is set. When the script is run as the first Python script, this name property is set to main to let the interpreter know that this is the first script. Any subsequent scripts that are called after the main through import statements have their name variables set to their file names. So if you import OS, then the OS script, which is just a .py file, will have its name variable to set to OS. This is a lot like namespacing in other languages and is basically Python's version of the practice. So now let's open the Python terminal, and I'll just exit from here. Clear out the screen. So make sure you are in the Lendy folder. And of course, I should have this Lendy py file. It needs to be in the Lendy move it to the correct. So it should be in the Lendy folder. There we have it. And run it from your command line. And it should start the server and gives us some valuable feedback. And if you go to this address, you can use localhost and 5000. So we will get an 404 error in our browser, and you will see that in our terminal. It's the first line that is important. So the server returned a 404 because we haven't given any views or templates yet to our code. So let's add those. So if we go back to our Lendy application and add the following code. Explain in a minute. There's an indentation error here, which I need to correct. So this is the real magic and power of Flask in action. Note that Flask uses decorator methods to create our HTTP routes. This saves us a lot of time, makes the code easier to maintain. With these specific routes, we're telling Flask that if anyone hits the endpoint of /login or the root directory with a slash, and the login function will be called, and you'll evaluate the value of the request method. We discussed this earlier in this lesson. Here we allow post and get methods and handle each specifically. Then we check the username and password values that are passed in, and if they are true, we alert the user that he or she has been logged in, and we can take them to the login.html template via the render_template method. Basically, we want the user to hit the login page when visiting the site. So let's set up the other views for our pages. So add the following code. This is not a function. It gets the lendy data's get_item function from that file. Lots of parentheses, and let me just check if I haven't missed something here. Comma too much here. This should be Dict. Seem to be bracket too much. Sorry guys, just had one bracket too much here, so it's not supposed to be a bracket here. before item. And these are just details that are very important to get if you want your code to work. It seems correct. So this code is similar to the preceding code. When a user hits the endpoint /inventory, the show inventory function will be invoked and run. This function is calling the get_db function shown earlier, and then is executing the getItems API function, making a query for all the items in the table. Then we construct the dictionary of the field names and values used in the web page. And we are then passing this directory to our template for population. Note, this endpoint doesn't have a method's equal argument being passed to the route method. That is because the default method is get, so there is no need to pass the argument to the function. So what if you want to add items to our inventory? So let's add that endpoint to our blendy.py file. Parentheses. Again, there is a Does this make sense? Let me check. Let's add some comments what it does. So this method uses the get_members API function to find the owner's ID from the name captured in the form. It then calls the add item API functions to add the item to the database. So if you try to run this code at the moment, we'll still won't be able to see anything because we haven't actually created the templates. The templates are what the browser will actually show the user. So this is where the HTML magic lives. However, the real magic lies in the power of having those templates to be able to pass data to our Python middleware. So we'll look at the templates. So I'm going to pause the video to type in a file called base.html. You can, it's already included in the zip file, so feel free to just copy it or type it in, and I recommend you to type it yourself. So I have typed the base.html file, like here. Pause the video and type in exactly as I've done, or use the file from the zip archive that I have provided. And when dealing with templates, there is usually a base HTML file that will hold the base scaffolding for your site. This usually includes navigation and other pieces of the page setup that will not be changing throughout the app. This is how many of the one-page web apps work with templates. So once you have your base template in order, you can start making our other pages. We will need a login screen, an inventory list screen, and an inventory add screen. So let's look at the important parts of each so that we have a better understanding of just how each piece is working with the others. So this is the login.html file. Note that the first line indicates that this template is extended from the base.html. You declare that first so that your templating engine understands that you want to include all the pieces of base.html on your page. Each page will have this line included so as to indicate which HTML file you'll be extending from. Secondly, note the block body line. This indicates that you have a body block which will include the HTML that you want to display. All of the HTML is wrapped in the block body and end blocks notation. And these tags indicate the dynamic parts of the template. And for instance, let's look at the if error part. Notice the difference between the if error tag and the error tag. The double curly braces indicate that you will be populating that space with data from your app. The value inside those braces is a variable that you will be passing to the template via your functions in the code, Flask code. The curly brace with the percentage sign indicates an action for the template engine to act upon. So the block body indicates to the template engine that you are starting the block body. And the if error percentage tag indicates that you will be performing some logic in the template. This notation is very common in many templating engines, so you'll probably see it often if you want to work with web development. So if we try to start so if we try to reload this, then we have the login page. So if you get an error, just double check your typing and your indentation. Also recall the example section in this lesson and use the Chrome DevTools to inspect your requests for any clues about your error. So now we want to add the screens we'll use to list our items and add an item to our inventory. Again, I have provided the HTML files, but feel free to type them all out for your own muscle memory. So I'm going to pause the video again and create and open an items.html file. So I'll just pause the video. And this is the items file. So pause the video and type from the screenshot, or use the file that I provided in case I have some typing error in here. So here we are passing a form, action, and method. If we are logged in, we're setting up the form to take the new item and create a post method that will then be passed to the add item URL, which is a mapping to the add item function in the lendy.py file. Another interesting part in this template is that it contains two functionalities in this one template. One is the adding of items and the other is the listing. If you are logged in, you can add items and see the item listing. If you are not logged in, you can only see the list of items. You have many ways to display this information. You could make separate screens for listing items and adding items. You can hide divs using CSS and display the adding of items only if the user clicks a button. Feel free to try a few options for this functionality to find one you like best. We'll stick with a quick and dirty way for now. And the next step is adding in the CSS. This step is very simple. The CSS has been provided for you in the static folder of the zip file named style.css. It's very common for style.css to be the base CSS file in a project. So our CSS file is very simple. However, the power of CSS is great and its functionality can be amazing. Feel free to experiment with other ways to implement your app using different CSS values. For now, we'll just use the file that I provided. So if you go to the zip file and go to the static and just copy the file into this our static folder, and we have these files. So this is the CSS. This is quite takes time to type out, so pause the video, or actually just use the file which I provided and either copy that or type it in. And also, for the sake of structure, or include a 404.html file in case your user gets to a page that is not there. So they will display this message. You can customize as you like. Just a bug update in your app.config.update. I forgot to add name in the user, so in this part, remember, just correct it to username. And another bug is when I was typing is the show inventory. It has to be typed correctly. I had inventory, So please correct that as well if you have just followed my example. Another typo from mine, the items.html file is item in items. I had just item, so I didn't get the file to show the items properly. So if you fire up your browser with localhost semicolon 5000 and you use username with the username that you provided, and the password in my case username was admin and password was tiger, and you get in and you get a message you were logged in. Let's try to add an item. And I think we had Joe in there, so let's try to submit it, and it adds the item to our database. So now you have a working app for our lending application. You can see the items that are in here, and we can add an item as well. So just a comment on the style.css is that note that you are defining some base styles for your basic elements, body, h1, h2, and so on. Then you define some classes, those lines beginning with a period. The period denotes the class name in CSS and ID names as denoted with the pound or sharp sign. The most important part is the .flash class. This is a Flask feature. Flask has flash, which will flash error messages or other system feedback to the user by displaying text on the screen. So you can go back and look at the previous code and see where the flash function was called and how you're using it. So that's it, we're done. We have created a small Flask app to help us keep track of our inventory of things. So if you may encounter some errors, so check over your code for spelling and syntax mistakes. I did that as well right now. So most especially in Python, indentation errors. So if you still can't figure out what may causing your error, fire up your Chrome DevTools and start inspecting the requests that you're sending and what the server is returning upon the request. This may help you. And remember to check out the network tab. You may need to refresh the page to populate the network tab with the requests that have been made. So how it works, it's just we have set up a small web app using the Flask framework to do the heavy HTTP lifting. We set up an app that creates a database and allows us to connect to the database. We created tables in said database to store our data, and we then set up our views which tell the app how and when to return data and what data to return. We set up the endpoints, the slash and for example login inventory part of our URL, and map those to functions to help us pass data back and forth from the templates to the database. We then created templates to display all the information, and using Jinja as our templating engine, we set things up so that the templates can pass data back and forth with the lendy.py file. We then style things to make them pretty and easier on the user. So that's it for this lesson, and we'll talk more about working with simple servers in the next section. So see you then, and play around with this app And if you don't get something to work, use the files I provided and play around with those. Okay, see you in the next lesson.